CO2. And I told you about this because I already showed you this famous curve, right? The Keeling curve. Did I already show you this? He died in 2005. Today, CO2 is around here. It's continued to increase predictably. And other scientists have measured other gases, not just CO2. This shows methane and nitrous oxide. And just to restate what I've told you before, we cannot explain temperatures unless we include those human forces. And then it is the only way to explain temperature is with a human role. Do you remember the distinction between the blue line and the pink line? We talked about this yesterday. Blue is the natural factors alone, and they explain temperature as far as we know it until about 60 years ago. And about 60 years ago, natural factors can no longer capture data. The only way to explain data is to add human activity to those natural factors, and then when you add human activity to natural cycles, we do capture the data. I don't know if you've heard, a lot of people think we should wait for more evidence. We had a very high-ranking public official who said the jury is still out on climate change, while that very high-ranking public official was still in his office. We already knew that the ocean's been warming, that sea level's been rising, that our planet as a whole is absorbing extra heat, and you would predict most of that would go in the water, and we've measured that. Almost all of that extra heat in the last decade and a half, 2 decades. While people talk about more evidence, we've noticed a pretty unusual trend in Arctic temperatures, which helps explain another unusual trend in the loss of Arctic ice caps. Now, some people say, hey man, it's natural. The planet heats up and the planet cools down. Maybe we're just in a period of natural warming. Well, first of all, we know that we're actually in a period of natural cooling now. But aside from that, look at the last 1,500 years of Arctic ice pack volume. You can see, sure, it goes up and down, but it never drops as quickly as recently because it never heats up as quickly as recently.
It's a lot further down than it's ever been before.
And it's also much further down than it's ever gone, right? And if you're not convinced by the South Pole, allow me to remind you that the same is true of Greenland. Its volume is also dropping quickly, which explains the conveyor belt's collapse, which we've measured. Again, we know that the Indian Ocean is hotter and rainier, the North Pacific is hotter and rainier, and the North Atlantic is colder and drier. Only explanation would be the collapse of the current that we've also measured and explained because of Greenland's melting. While people talk about waiting for more evidence, this pattern has been established over and over and over again by various teams of scientists. Look, if you look at the blue line, the red line, and the black line, there is significant disagreement between the blue line, the red line, and the black line. You can see that scientists have data to compare, and they don't agree exactly. Tyler might say, my red line says we were -5 below average in 1910. And Daniel could say, no, my data says we were -4 degrees in 1910. And Ryan could say, no, 1910. You can see that the numbers are not perfectly identical. There is clearly a lot of room left for scientific consensus to grow. But you also have to admit that we're roughly in agreement about the rough strokes, it's getting a lot hotter. And if 160 years doesn't satisfy you, don't forget that last Thursday, someone published really compelling data about the last 11,500 years, which again shows you we've gone from the lowest temperature in the last 11,000 years to the highest temperature in 11,000 years in a period of under 100. And almost all that gain was made in the last 20. I don't know, man. Maybe it's refutable. Because what is this I keep hearing? You know, I was watching Fox News, and they said there's a lot of debate. I went to church, and they said... you know, yeah, I didn't know that was part of the second coming. Apparently, I should read more. I'm back. It is going to get hot. Okay. You kind of have to wonder, where does this come from? You know, you can do a survey of all Western nations. You know, countries that are relatively well developed, that have good educational systems. And among all Western nations, do you know which country doubts global warming the most?
America.
We're number one. Yeah.
I was going to say, this senator who's like more progressive on climate change and whatnot supported a bill with, I think maybe Senator Fox or someone anyway. He put out this this list of the scientists that doubt global warming, and that has like the amount of times they've appeared in front of Congress and the amount they're paid by oil companies and energy companies, coal companies.
I'd love to see that because I'm getting into where this comes from.
Is it okay if I post it on Facebook?
Sure. I'm inventive. Well, the so-called debate is not that much of a debate. A couple of years ago, this researcher randomly picked 10,257 Earth scientists. As long as they work on some sort of an Earth science, they were put into the pool, and then they were picked at random. So they tried to remove gender bias, even though most scientists are men. They tried to equally represent women. Even though most scientists work in a few countries, they tried to, give some representation to other nations. They did their best, I'm guessing, to be fair about who they asked. And when they asked, 89% of Earth scientists agree that humans are primarily responsible for climate change. But when you limit that sample to the ones who have published research about climate, you get less than 1% who deny that humans are changing the climate. They had to round it up for this diagram. It was actually 0.8 something. Other studies have been done. These guys asked climate experts in general whether or not they've published about climate recently. This was a slightly more open-ended, and I think this one had a smaller data sample too. These might have been only English-speaking or only in the United States. I can't remember what the complaint about this study. Anyway, 97% of them were convinced. And this is even better. A researcher did a study on all studies of scientists. And so, starting with 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2011, you can see there were 4 studies in 2009. This guy made one nifty little graph that breaks down scientific opinion. And you notice some of those years the total is not 100, because some of those other researchers asked a question in the middle, not convinced either way. But you have to admit, this is pretty darn close to a scientific consensus. And so, where does this so-called debate come from? Well, I love this country's media. I tell you what, I've been in a lot of countries where media is biased, and I really like that we have a long-standing tradition of what we call balanced reporting. What I mean by balanced reporting is if you're going to put somebody on the air to talk about how Starbucks is evil, you got to give Starbucks a chance to get on the air and say, no, actually, we're not evil. Or if you're going to get somebody on the news to talk about this new legislation that limits the rights of certain citizens to get certain social services, then you've got to have somebody on the interview who's going to talk about the opposing legislation. Opposing points of view. It's a beautiful thing. Thank God our media has opposing points of view. But interestingly, the scientists who keep saying the same stuff are kind of boring. It's like, okay, so when I was on this same channel last year, I told you the same thing I'm going to tell you now. You know, gases wobble, we give them off, heating. More gases, more heating, planet's getting warmer because of our activity. Any questions? And everybody goes, snooze, we heard that guy last year. But we found some other crazy nutcase who says, booga, booga, booga! I believe in leprechauns and the Easter Bunny, and I don't believe in climate change. And they go, wow, that guy looks really newsworthy. And so, in order to show balance, and keep the news interesting, we've heard sort of a lot of some other side of the fence, and you'll notice there's a really interesting pattern, because 72% of media coverage of climate includes a skeptical point of view or outright denies climate change. Our public is perfectly aligned with what they see on the news. Even more so. Yeah, slightly biased toward the no side. 72% of news coverage is skeptical or denies. 74% of Americans are skeptical or denies. And those 2% are not statistically significant. You could say that they're perfectly aligned. I'm sorry to make this such a biased topic, because I know that I'm talking about some of you, and some of your moms, and some of your dads, and some of your grandpas. And I really don't want this to be a personal thing. I don't want to get into this. I hate that this forces a confrontation, but there is a simple distinction that we really need to make. There are things that science can talk about and things that science cannot. For example, the existence of God is not a scientific question. That is a very good example of what you have to either believe or not believe, or maybe not have an opinion about. I'll try to keep this short. I don't want to lecture you about God. If you believe in God, that's fine. If you don't believe in God, that's fine. But science has no data to work with. So we cannot prove God and we cannot disprove God. Science cannot touch that question. So we have no evidence to deal with. We have no recording of God, or photograph of God, or evidence of God. So we have to work on belief. And that's a good way for you to think of what a belief is. things that cannot be tested, can neither be proved nor disproved, those are your belief systems. When people say that they don't believe climate change, I get a little